Hi there, you're listening to the Steve Schramm Show, where we train Christians to become confident, passionate servants of Jesus so they can grow in their walk with God and share their faith more persuasively. Welcome to the show. Well, we're not going to waste any time this week. We're going to dive back into our interview, the second part of the interview that I shared a few weeks ago with David Pallman on the Faith Because of Reason YouTube channel.
Gotcha. All right. So now here's one that's been popular lately. It would be John Walton's cosmic temple view of Genesis and inspiring philosophies, making this popular, well, like he did with process structuralism. Like, I never heard of process structuralism before he released his videos on evolution. And then when he released his videos on evolution, making, here's the big Christian apologist YouTuber arguing for process structuralism. Now I encounter it everywhere. Well, it's sort of a similar thing with John Walton's view on the cosmic temple. I never encountered this before. Well, before John Walton, because I'd heard John Walton before. But when Inspiring Philosophy, Michael Jones took that interpretation. Now he's popularizing that on his channel, and I am running into this a lot. So John Walton's cosmic temple view of Genesis is just like, you can get more details if you want, but to basically put it in one sentence, it's basically saying that Genesis is more about functionality than describing the creation accurately. So I'm curious to hear, if you have any thoughts or critiques on that.
Yeah, it's it is a popular view these days, and let's face it, it removes a lot of the difficulty. I mean, if you can argue for this and affirm this view, then you can escape having to talk about the age of the earth in most cases. I mean, you could just totally say, Genesis is about this. I mean, in other words, it's attractive. I don't know that he has come out and said the words, "I am a theistic evolutionist," right? John Walton. But he's like on the board of Biologos. He talks to those guys a lot. He's publicly said that his view would allow for theistic evolution, etc. So from a theological standpoint, it's very, very popular. Now, I have to just admit, because of what we talked about in the beginning, I mean, I'm not a scientist, I'm not a specialist theologian. I went into ministry, to this aspect of ministry, because I think what's important is to let people know about where young age creationist research is. So I'm not an expert in John Walton's stuff, and I've dialogued back and forth with some guys on this. But for me, I think that I think he's wrong, but I certainly think that it's a very popular view because it makes room for theistic evolution. And what I hear, again, this is hearsay, but what I hear is that the popular writings of John Walton go a lot further in what they claim than the technical writing. In other words, I often hear that he'll write something for a popular audience, but then if you go and look at the actual technical papers, his claims are a lot more modest. That kind of thing. I have heard. I'm just saying that I've heard that.
So he pulls a Bart Ehrman on us.
I mean, essentially that kind of thing. I mean, I hate to say that. I don't like to question people's motives. Okay, I really don't. So I don't want to say that he has a bad motive or something like that. But I do. I mean, I've heard this now from a couple different people, from people that I do have reason to believe have read pretty deeply into the literature. So I guess I'll just say this. It seems to me, again, you did mention, right, this view, I mean, cosmic temple is just one aspect of it. It's a big part of it, but it is just one aspect of it. I think that you could probably have some kind of temple motif in the text, but it would relate to the biblical temple. I don't think we need to relate it to pagan temples, extra Israel for certain. But the view essentially is concerned with functional. Sometimes this is called functional creation or functional ontology. And he says that it's hard, really to know what was going on there in the beginning because they weren't concerned with the material, but with function. Okay. The problem with this is that's certainly not obviously what's going on in the text. Is function mentioned? Of course it is. But material is mentioned as well. Bill Craig has done quite a bit on this so far, and he references Walton favorably in some things, but on this, he's pretty unforgiving, I gotta say. I just want to read this quote to you. This is a quote from Dr. Craig's Defenders class. When he's talking about this view. Here's what he says, quote, "When it comes to Genesis 1, in order for this text to feature only functional creation, you must imagine that the dry land, the vegetation, the trees, the sea creatures, the birds, all the animals, and even man were all there right from the beginning, but they weren't functioning in an ordered system. It seems to me that such an interpretation is implausible, not to say ridiculous." I wish I could say that in my best Bill Craig voice, but I can't. "It would require us to regard as literally false all of the statements about the darkness, the primeval ocean, the emergence of the dry land and separation of the seas, the earth bringing forth vegetation and fruit trees, the waters bringing forth sea creatures, the earth bringing forth animals, and God making man." Now, if he's right about that, think about the implications of having to say that all of those things are literally false because they don't speak directly to the question of function. That seems really difficult to reckon with. So I think that's one problem with it. Dr. Craig also argues about how Walton kind of confuses the terminology of what it means to be functional versus material, but I'll leave that to the philosophers. It also should be noted that evidence seems to be spurious for this in other cultures. I think that's kind of the whole thing, is that this is supposed to be where Israel is bathed in the cultures of the other ancient Near Eastern folks. And to be honest with you, I don't think we see that. I don't think that the other ones are only concerned with function. I think there's a lot of material things going on and described in some of the other creation myths, etc. So even that being the case, I think that the biblical data needs to be handled on its own merits because of the great difference in worldview. So that's important. The functional ontology view of Walton works in concert with a lot of other things. Cosmic temple, that motif. The archetypal Adam versus a necessarily historical Adam. There's a strong emphasis in Walton's view, and these are all kinds of things that follow from the premise that the creation is functional, etc. That the emphasis in Genesis 3 and even throughout the whole redemption story is on order versus disorder, instead, really, of sin and redemption, righteousness, etc. So I think that this view of functional ontology is at least undermined if some of those other things turn out to be either false or unreasonable. And again, I think that the biggest thing is that Walton just simply hasn't demonstrated. He hasn't been able to demonstrate, I don't think, in the Bible that only function is concerned, or that even function is in view. Yeah, it's in view and it is important, but to make the case that that's exclusive, that function is the exclusive intended meaning of the passage or the passages in question, I don't know. I just don't see that. I think you can just read the text and come away with something much different than that. Last thing I'll say on that is Lydia McGrew. She dips her toe in a bunch of different areas these days. She's an analytical philosopher, and I've talked with her a few times. I like her. So she has written a pretty.
Her and her husband Tim are good.
Yeah, that's right. That's Tim McGrew's wife. A lot of people are going to know him, and yeah, those are some sweet people. And she has written a couple now. I don't know anybody out there who's familiar with Lydia's writing and her blog post. I mean, you need to get some coffee and chill out for an afternoon if you want to read that thing, because it is long and detailed. But I mean, she has written a couple. I don't know how she does it. She must type at 300 words a minute. I don't know, but she has written a couple pretty withering critiques of Walton on this issue as well. She's an analytical philosopher, so she might not have specialized training in Old Testament studies or in ancient Near Eastern studies, but you can bet that she understands how to look and evaluate the evidence, etc. So I think her critique is a good read. Her blog is called, I think, just what'swrongwiththeworld.com or something like that. So easy to find. I'd recommend you checking that out.
What's Wrong with the World?
I think it's .net. what'swrongwiththeworld.net is, I think, how you get to that. And you can search for John Walton, and you'll find a plethora of fun things to read.
Yes, Lydia's she's pretty unrelenting when she gets to critique you something.
Yeah, yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I'll move on to this one, because this is, I don't know if we have to spend a lot of time on this one, but Psalm 90 says that 1,000 years in your sight are like a day that has just gone by. So in the eyes of the Lord, we hear this a lot, that we hear that, well, one day to God must be a lot of longer than it is to us, because the Psalm 90 even says it.
Right.
Now, on the one hand, I would be tempted to, toss this aside, because it's the Psalms. You don't build theology out of the Psalms. Just no. But on the flip, I had Stephen Meyer point this out, and I found this actually interesting. He points out that this is coincidentally the only psalm that's attributed to Moses, and Moses is also the traditional author of Genesis. Is traditionally believed to be the author of Genesis by conservative Christians, and certainly among Young Earth Creationists. Even if more conservative Christians are more open than Moses didn't, generally the Young Earthers are still going to accept it. Right. So basically, if there's any place that Moses was going to give us an indication on what he thought the word day meant, it would be in this psalm, and he tells us that he looks at it that in God's eyes it says 1,000 years. So that kind of gave more plausibility with that to it, at least to me. I'm curious what you think.
Okay, two things. Well, the first thing is, if Moses was going to define what he meant by a day, I think he would define it in the text itself, in the actual context. I mean, we have to interpret via context. We use other places in the Bible to get things, but the immediate context always is where we get the interpretation from, right? I mean, that's Greg Kokel. Never read a Bible verse. Let's go a few verses before, a few verses after, etc., and figure it out. Well, I've already argued. I mean, I think persuasively, I used some arguments from different places, but the bulk of my argument about the days in Genesis was taken from Dr. Robert McCabe. He was the former Old Testament professor. He's retired now at I want to say it was Detroit Baptist Theological Seminary. So that was what he pointed out, that, the word is defined for us multiple times in Genesis 1. We have a day. We have a 12-hour period of daytime. We have what would seem to then be a 24-hour period of the period of time that passes when you have a cycle of daytime and a cycle of nighttime. Whatever time that is, that is a day, according to Genesis 1. So I think Genesis 1 defines it. I don't think Moses has to define it in the Psalms. Now, you are right. We don't build a theology off the Psalms. The Psalms are highly poetic. That seems to be, or at least it should be, a given. This is that kind of language. And again, I would say never read a Bible verse. If you go back and look at the passage, I did this. I didn't write it all down, but if you go back and look at the passage, the obvious implication is it's a theological point that says God is over and above time. He's bigger than you and I. Peter says something similar to this. There's another statement that sounds a lot like this that Moses wrote. And the way Peter says it is, 1,000 years is as the Lord as one day, and one day is 1,000 years. So it reverses itself back on it. It's not the kind of thing that is meant to be taken as a literal statement. And it's one way or the other. We have to look at this. It's either to be taken in this wooden literal sense, or it's not. Okay, now in a psalm, I think that we should always default to not taking it that way, because we understand that the Psalms are songs. They are theological in nature. They're not meant to convey literal historical points like that in most cases. So let's do a reductio on it. If it literally means that a day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, etc., if in God's eyes one of our days is 1,000 years, then that means creation took place over 6 1,000-year periods. That's what it would have to mean, I think, right? Unless I'm missing the point there. If we were taking it that literally, then that's what we would have to maintain, is that every day was 1,000 years. Well, that doesn't match up with what Meyer believes about the history of the earth. So that can't be right. But then if it's non-literal, then it's non-literal, and it doesn't mean that. It can't be used to say that a day actually is as 1,000 years with the Lord. It can't if it's non-literal. So we would have to get the understanding of day from elsewhere. And again, I would recommend the actual historical passage. Anytime we see the word like or as, my wife could probably correct me. I don't remember grammar class that well, but I'm pretty sure that's going to be a simile or a metaphor, one of those two. And these are metaphorical language. It's a comparative it's a comparison that is made for a specific purpose. I think the purpose here is theological, and again, that's the passage is Psalm 90, and I think if you just go read that passage on your own time, you'll see that this is not meant to communicate that Moses thought that a day with God, in our mind, was 1,000 years in God's time. God does not operate on a separate time frame than us. I don't see that either. So anyway, that's what I would say about that.
All right. Well, then let's turn to the question of evolution. And I know we could easily do like a series on this, the two of us going off on this. Sure. But we'll try to keep it as reasonably brief as possible. Yeah. Without jipping the audience. But,
and
the question of evolution is.
Oh, sorry, no. You go ahead and then I'll follow up.
All right, so I was just saying, this is obviously a hot button contention, and this is one I'm probably not even going to disagree with you that much on, but it's going to be just the issue of evolution. Why ask people to affirm something that science is proven?
So you're right. We could spend hours and hours and hours talking about this subject, I'm sure. But interestingly, one of the things you'll find about me, and this is if you talk to me online or whatever, which anybody is welcome, by the way. I'm just SW Schramm on all the social stuff. If you want to come find me there, you can, and we'll hash some of this stuff out. I don't have a ton of time, but if it looks like you'll be a gracious sparring partner, we could talk for a few minutes. So I try to distill things down to the most basic, simple understanding of them. I'm not a scientist. If I was arguing with Francis Collins, if Francis Collins was on this call, he would probably tear me up and chew me up and spit me out all day long because I don't understand the inner workings of the science. I can read it and understand it and have my opinions on it, but I'm not going to be able to argue in as sophisticated a way as the guys that I read, for example, who are scientists and are trained in evolutionary biologists. So I try to distill things down. And here's how I understand evolution. Evolutionary biology is a framework, okay? It is a framework through which evidence can be interpreted. There are things that will support evolution that don't necessarily prove that evolution is true, but they lend support for it. It's like I can't stand when people say there's no evidence for this. There are very few things that there is no evidence for. There is some evidence for lots of false views. And I think evolution is one of those things. Now, I think there is a lot of evidence that can be marshaled for common ancestry. I don't think common ancestry is true. I have reasons for that. But I think that there is evidence that can be marshaled for that. The real question is can that evidence be explained in a biblical framework? And I think that it can. So when we look at evolution, I take this down to be a lot simpler than most people do. We could argue the fine details. We could talk for days about the fine details of common ancestry, etc. Whether the chromosome 2 fusion spot, provides sufficient proof that chimpanzees are related to you and I, etc. We could talk about those individual pieces of evidence, but at the end of the day, it's a framework for evolutionary, or it's a framework for biological classification. That's what evolution is at the heart of it. Therefore, evolution is a philosophy. And just as evolution is a philosophy, so creation is a philosophy. There are scientific details, some scientific details which will support evolution. Some of those same scientific details will support creation. Sometimes evolution and creation make the same kind of predictions, believe it or not. Many times they don't. So these are interpretive philosophies. Now, the creation interpretive philosophy for biology is called Brahmanology. And this, I might by habit say Baraminology. I've heard it said both ways. I don't know. It's one of those. The word Brahman is derived from Scripture. It simply means created kind. The Hebrew word min is thought to basically mean kind. It's when the Bible says that something reproduces after its kind or whatever. This is the word that's in view. Bara, of course, is a biblical word, means to create, Hebrew word. So these are the created kind. So the project of young age creationist biology is to find out what the created kinds were. Now, this is ongoing work. I mean, this is the term Brahmanology, the actual the method that was developed called Brahmanology wasn't developed until 1992, I think, is when the paper was released on it. So it's new. I mean, in scientific terms, I mean, this is new stuff. It was developed by Kurt Wise, and he was working on the shoulders of people who have gone before him, like Frank Lewis Marsh, and there were others in the Seventh-day Adventist community. A lot of the early creation scientists, and a lot of them even today, were Seventh-day Adventists. And it doesn't mean that they were wrong. It just means that they were the first ones to tackle this from a scientific perspective. Okay, so anyway, he starts on creating this method of what is called systematics or biosystematics, called Brahmanology. Now, today, in evolutionary biology, there's been multiple ones of these over the centuries, over the years rather. One was called evolutionary taxonomy, another one was called phonetics, and the most recent one is called cladistics. If you ever watched a R. Ra debate on young age creationism, he goes on and on and on about this. So cladistics. This is the method of biosystematics that is used in evolutionary biology, and the creationist counterpart to this is called Brahmanology. Now, here's why I laid all that out. Remember, I told you I was trying to make this as simple as possible, distill this down to the real issue. The real issue comes down to what these methods are able to detect. Cladistics, I don't care what anybody tells you, cladistics is in the business of finding continuity. It is in the business of finding similarity. It is blind to meaningful dissimilarity between organisms. And if we look in the Bible, we have clear justification for seeing similarities and differences. Just one example is that Israel was okay, it was cool with God for Israel to eat certain kinds of animals, and very uncool with God for Israel to create certain other kinds of animals. And this is because there were actual qualitative and even quantitative differences between them. So we need a method that sufficiently can account for diversity in creation. In other words, evolutionary biology, the evolutionary framework, simply finds what it's looking for. If you're looking for continuity and your method only gives you continuity, then you're going to find continuity. That's why we can make these phylogenetic trees, etc. That's why those who affirm common ancestry can build a tree of life, even if we may disagree with parts of it, etc. But that's why they can build a tree of life that has these classifications and these arms going this way and that way that show this relation all the way back to one universal common ancestor. They do it because that's what the method gives them. It's built in. On Brahmanology, we use different measurements of things, and again, there are a ton of these, but different morphological things, genetic things. We look at fossils. We try to classify into these different classifications to figure out if there is diversity so great that we cannot move past a certain line of relationship. Some organisms are legitimately not related to one another, and what young age creationists have been saying for some time at this level through baraminology is that there's a little bit of blurring between the genera of family and order. If you're used to that terminology on the Linnaean classification system, there's a little bit of blurring there. So sometimes it's the family, sometimes it's the order. But generally speaking, you're not going to get the ability for evolution to occur past the level of family. If you want to define evolution as change that can happen at the species level, etc., fine. I don't like it, but I'll go along with it, okay? Because you can define evolution that way. You can't move past about the level of family in most cases. That's what so far creationist biosystematics have been showing. Well, I don't want to give you any spoilers, but Dr. Mike Behe, who is not a young Earth creationist, he is one of the chief proponents of intelligent design. He does affirm universal common ancestry, and yet his latest book, which is, I think, 300 and some pages, called Darwin Devolves, the central point of the book is this: you can't move, genetically speaking, looking at the biology, you can't move past, in most cases, the level of family, and in some cases, order. So essentially, we have confirmation for this view from another field, from a specialist in Dr. Mike Behe, from somebody who doesn't even agree on what the creationists have been saying for years now with respect to the baraminological data we have so far. Now, there's a lot more to do, right? I mean, again, I just mentioned that it's still kind of in its infancy. It was only invented in 1992 as a method. But we're doing more and more organisms, more and more research is being devoted to it. And so here's what I'm saying. We're able to show that for much of the data that we see, there's a creationist explanation. Even if there's an evolutionary explanation, okay, well, they have their explanation, and we can talk about the details of that. But I'm more interested in coming over here and saying, no, there's a creationist explanation for the biological diversity that we see. And if we can show that the Bible seems to discredit evolution because of the time factor, if nothing else, then I think that we can move forward rationally. So that's one thing. You sent me a couple questions ahead of time, and one of the things you said about this is, why ask Christians to affirm that evolution is false? Do I have time to just read through a quick little list of things that I wrote down about why? It's real quick.
Yeah, you can. We got about like 10-ish minutes left. So
okay. We got to get it. We got to get a move on. You might have to do a two-parter here, unless you got a burger to go eat or something. I don't know. Well, I won't read through all of those. I think you're going to probably do some videos at some point on theistic evolution, so I will let you take charge on that. Needless to say, is I've got a list of probably between 10 and 15 things that I wrote down in about 3 minutes, literally, of thinking about it, that things that have to be true, almost by necessity, if theistic evolution is the case, and I think they are all very bad things. So maybe suffice it to say that I'm not a non-evolutionist because I don't think the data can support it. But the primary reason is I think that biblically it's a disaster, to be blunt. So anyway, there's that.
Yeah, I'm working on an 8-part series. My first, it's going to be on intelligent design, but my first video should be out probably later this week, and then my second video is going to just be a full-blown critique of evidences for common ancestry, and then the 8th episode is going to be a critique of theistic evolution. So
awesome, great.
There will be stuff coming out on that.
Great. That's great.
Yeah, let's just, we take short answers on these.
Let's do it. Yeah.
But science proving the Earth is 4.6 billion years old. I'm sorry, we're not going to have more time for this, but
no,
it's work after this. So,
that's fine.
But carbon-14 dating, ice cores, and starlight problem.
Yeah.
Just a brief explanation of those is that carbon-14 dating, we basically know. I'm going to botch the explanation, but basically things half-life, and we can measure that, and if we go back enough, we get about 4.6 billion years old for the Earth. With ice cores, we know that how many layers of ice get put in an ice core per year, and so by calculating that, we get much older than Young Earth Creationism will allow for. And then as far as starlight goes, we know how many millions or how fast light can travel, and we know it would have taken millions of years for us to be able to see it. And since we can't see it, it would then follow that the Earth is millions of years old.
Yeah, sure. So I'm going to give you the too long, don't read, or however you say that, too long to read on it first, and then I'll go back and answer those briefly. I think the most important part of our conversation is maybe the way we're going to wrap this up. So let me just be brief about these, but the bottom line is each one of these. Now, let me just say that carbon-14 dating, I wouldn't say they necessarily botched the explanation. It's just that carbon-14 dating is not what gives us millions of years. Actually, we can't get much past 60,000 years with carbon-14 dating. That's a specific kind of radiometric dating, and actually past 12,000 years, or even actually it might be less than that. I think in order to reasonably get to about 12,000 years or so, because of where we have the oldest living trees, you actually have to use dendrochronology, tree ring dating, to confirm those dates. It's called calibrating the method, and again, that's uncontroversial. This is what they do. So, carbon-14 dating, it doesn't really phase creationism that bad. Actually, in a lot of cases, it helps us because we have diamonds that are millions of years old that should not have any C14 in them that do. We have other organisms. Oh my goodness, I cannot say that. Other deceased, formerly living creatures and such that have C14 in them that are supposedly millions of years old, so thus they should not have C14 in them. So C14 is my friend. Other methods of radiometric dating, though, as well as the starlight problem, as well as the ice core problem. Each one of these, the bottom line, is that most critiques that I see of the young age view on this assume the assumptions necessary, right, okay, for the old age position to be true. So you can't critique young age creationism using old age creationism's assumptions. That leads to straw man very quickly. That's not how it works. So with radiometric dating as a broader discipline, for example, this is the really interesting question, is there are assumptions that go into radiometric dating that may not be true. Now, some of those assumptions, and there are three, basically it's that we know the amount of daughter versus, and you'll have to look up the technical stuff on this on your own time because we don't have time, but basically we have to know that there was a certain amount of what was called the parent element at the beginning. We have to know that there was none of the daughter element in the mineral or whatever it is that we're testing. We have to know that there was no contamination over the years, and we have to know that the rate was consistently the same. Those first two assumptions are helped out by something called the isochron dating method, and it gives us reason to think that the Earth really is billions of years old, for sure. I mean, if you're taking that data at face value from the isochron method, we could get there, except that it doesn't address the question of the rate of decay. The question is the rate of decay constant really over time? And I think that the answer to that is clearly no. Most rocks give evidence both of the fact that a long time, radiometrically speaking, a lot of decay has occurred. That suggests that these things have been there for a long time, billions of years in some cases. However, those same rocks, the vast majority of them, have indicators of youth in them. And we don't have time to get into what those are, but the rocks and the fossils, etc., that you're testing on this stuff, they have indicators both of youth and great age. And the most reasonable, I think, explanation of this is that something happened in the past which would have caused those rates to be accelerated. So that, coupled with the fact that just scores of examples of inconsistencies in radiometric dating, we can observe. We have rocks where part of the rock dates inconsistently with another part of the rock. We have rocks where different methods give significantly different dates, millions and millions of years, significantly different dates. We have rocks that we know are young by observation. They formed in our lifetimes that date radiometrically as old, again, because some of these assumptions. So it seems to me that radiometric dating only works flawlessly, so to speak, on those ones that we don't have definitive evidence in the future, or in the present, I should say, are actually young. So that is a little spurious to me. But I'm going to recommend resources here in a little bit, and just don't take my word for it. Trust me, there are guys who can argue this much better than me. But the bottom line is this. Even if the one method shows, the isochron method, that two of those assumptions can be overcome, the one assumption, and it's the crucial one, cannot be touched by the isochron method. And the actual rocks seem to tell us that we have indicators of both youth and great age. So we have to work that out. And spoiler alert, creationists think the flood provides an explanation for that. Ice cores, okay, same exact thing, right? The way we understand ice cores has everything to do with our assumptions about how long they were in place, and thus how much compression they experienced. I think Paul Garner makes probably one of the best arguments I've seen for this in his book, The New Creationism. The real question is whether or not there are inconsistencies internally with the old age position versus the young age position. And what he has shown in that book is that on the old age position, we're supposed to have somewhere around 50 ice ages that have happened over the course of Earth history, but they have trouble demonstrating how the conditions would be sufficient to produce even one. So the ice core, we can't even talk about the ice cores until we talk about whether or not the thing was possible for it to even happen. And on creation, we think we do have a pretty good explanation for why a single ice age, we think there was only one, happened. And it followed the flood. So I'd encourage you to check out that resource for that. Ice cores proper aren't the problem. I think the data can be better explained by a creationist scenario. Finally, starlight. This is just another scenario where you have to look at the assumptions that go into what you're looking at before the evidence can be properly assessed. So any critique of recent creationism using Big Bang assumptions just aren't going to work. The question is there internal inconsistency? Is there good evidence for a Big Bang? Yes. Is there legitimate evidence in our universe that is puzzling on Big Bang cosmology? Oh, yeah, there are definitely those things. So it might be internally inconsistent. So then we have to look at the creationist angle, and there is no creationist consensus on the starlight issue. There are probably 4 or 5 right now that are in the mainstream that are getting, we're starting to work there. They're working towards it. Every few years we have what's called the International Conference on Creationism, and that's where all the smart guys get together and talk for a couple days. But there are a few theories that are perfectly consistent with what we know about the universe. They're consistent with relativity. They're biblically consistent. They don't impugn the character of God, etc. So I guess I would just say that don't critique these things, or don't allow yourself to be persuaded by critiques of these things that use the assumptions of the other view. Read what the view entails. Read what kinds of things would be the case or could be the case on young age creationism. Read the people who actually put papers out, real scientific papers, and talk about these things. And take their arguments on the basis of the assumptions of the view. That's how we have to do these things, or else we're just talking past each other, and I think that's a lot of the problem. I would say this, with respect to the starlight issue, you could read a paper on creation time coordinates that was written by Tikhomir Tenev, Mark Horstemeyer, and John Baumgartner, all 3 really smart guys. And I think it's my podcast. I have a podcast series, 2-part podcast series on that, creation time coordinates. My personal opinion is that they're the closest to right with respect to starlight, but there are other theories, and some of those are good too. So.
All right, and so then just to wrap this up, tell us why Young Earth Creationism is important, why you think it's having trouble being accepted, and then you can just go from there into recommended resources.
Absolutely right. And by the way, let me just say a little something about this idea of the assumption. The crucial assumption that really takes place is this attachment. In old age circles, whether they be conventional or Christian, etc., there is this attachment to uniformitarianism. And we have to learn to separate the uniformity of nature from uniformitarianism. If uniformitarianism is not the case, then there is no problem accepting any of the claims. I don't want to say so broadly, but most of the claims of young age creationism are perfectly fine and consistent if we can reject uniformitarianism. So that's the key. That's the key assumption that feeds all the other assumptions. I think the Bible suggests that uniformitarianism is false, so that's where we go. Why is Young Earth Creationism important? I think the question of age matters. I mentioned earlier that there are some organizations who talk about age. Some people talk about design. Everybody has their own kind of thing. I think that because the implications from a historical reading of the Bible tell us something about the age, I think it matters. I think that death before the fall matters. I mean, if you can explain that away biblically, or explain, I don't want to say explain it away, but if you can explain that differently biblically, then fine, we can talk about that. But I think the Bible is clear that there was no death before the fall. And if that's the case, then old age creationism of any sort has to be wrong. So that's why it's important. One of the things you asked is, why is it having trouble being accepted? Well, I guess as we wrap this interview up, I'll just go ahead and make everybody mad all at once. Hopefully that sounds good. So I think it's three things. First, young earth creationist popularizers today, many of them come across as jerks. They make grander claims than they should, and they treat those who espouse other views like they are aiming to reject the Bible. I said earlier, I don't want to question people's motive. All I'm going to say further about that is when we question people's motives, we get into trouble. We really do. Let's make an effort as young age creationists, anybody who's listening and a young age creationist, let's make an effort to understand everybody else and make sure that we don't sacrifice that beautiful relationship that we can have as Christian brothers and sisters fighting for the same cause over disagreement on this issue. The second thing, and here's where I say I'm just going to make everybody mad, there is a constant unwillingness that I see to engage with young age creationist ideas from those who hold to other views. I talk to so many theistic evolutionists and old age creationists of different sorts who pontificate publicly all the time about why young age creationism is wrong, but they will admit to me that they've never read it. They've never read the literature. There are lots of scholarly. There's evidence of this in scholarly circles. For me, a lot of it is simply anecdotal. There are lots of popularizers guilty of this. I spend a lot of time correcting people's false ideas about what creationists believe. If all I listened to was old earth creationist popularizers, I would be skeptical of young age creationism too. I don't blame you. Find out who the reasonable and well-argued and gracious young age creationists are. I'm about to tell you some. Engage with their ideas and the research. Even if you disagree, at least engage with the best version of it. And my final point where I'm making everybody mad is this. There's a ton of intellectual snobbery in Christian academia. Even people who I greatly respect, I regularly listen to them. They disagree on this topic, and they demonstrate their ignorance constantly. I just don't know a nicer way to say it. Just be more open. Like, seriously, be open to this, like I mentioned in the beginning. Abrasiveness and motive questioning is wrong, but so is high-mindedness, right? It's all... That's why we can never have a discussion around this without it being atomic. Ken Ham and Kent Hovind, whatever your thoughts on them, they do not speak for all of young age creationism, even if they're the loudest voices. Okay? Don't write it off before you engage with some better resources. Get another perspective on the issue. Do I have time to say just what some of those resources might be real quick?
Yeah, okay. Absolutely.
Okay, great. And I'm hoping you'll, maybe I can get you a list with links, etc. But I'm really hoping, if you wouldn't mind putting this list in the description on the video, that would just be really helpful, because I really, truly want people to engage.
Shoot me an email after this, and I can put it in the description.
Okay, I will. Here's I'm telling you the most important one first. It's $10. I know everybody doesn't have time to do this. Okay, not everybody has time to do this. But let me urge you, if you're listening to this, and you are someone who publicly writes, speaks, podcasts, anything of that sort, against young age creationism. I'm okay if you popularize your view, etc. If you're going to start a critique of young age creationism, I beg you to please go to isgenesishistory.com, purchase, I think it's under the watch tab, or maybe it's under the shop tab. It says 70 plus creation lectures. It's the IGH Educators Conference from 2017. Most importantly from this conference, there are two videos I think you have to see. They're from Kurt Wise. One's called The Age of Things, and another one is called The Fossil Record. Kurt is a PhD paleontologist from Harvard who studied under Stephen Jay Gould. He knows his stuff. The bottom line is I want you to go, if you're going to popularize against young age creationism, go watch the 74 videos. They're almost all an hour long. Not all of them. Most of them are almost an hour long, if not a little more, with, I think, the best voices. These are the people who I trust with the message of young age creationism for the most part. It's literally the most data-packed, research-packed, etc., from a gracious tone that you can possibly get. And you're not going to get any more information in this pack, any more information from reading papers and stuff than you can get in these videos. And I think they're just great. So if you do nothing else, if you're going to pontificate against this view, check out the Is Genesis History Conference. Just go to isgenesishistory.com and you can get those videos there. Some of those videos are available on YouTube. So again, you can check those ones out for free, and I still encourage you to buy the rest. Just a couple other things. The New Creationism. It's a book by Dr. or I don't think he's a doctor, but I think he master's in engineering, or no, it's biogeography or something like that. It's a book called The New Creationism. Super, again, gracious guy, well argued, gives the most accurate view of young age creationists as of 2010. Anyway. The Quest, written by Todd Wood. You need to read that to get an idea of the attitude of most modern creationists, the ones that aren't the loudest voices yet, but the ones that are making a big impact in academia with respect to creationism. So that's The Quest by Todd Wood. Faith, Form, and Time. It's a book by Dr. Kurt Wise, who I mentioned a minute ago. You got to get that. It's old information, 2002, 2003, but still some of the best stuff out there on creationism. And, those are the ones I truly wanted to mention. There are others in the list, but for time's sake, I won't mention those. I'll give those to you, and other people can check those out. But those are the main things, and specifically that conference, the Is Genesis History Student and Educators Conference, is going to give you the information that you need to accurately represent young earth creationism or young age creationism when you're speaking in public about it, when you're thinking about it, and when you read other people who have things to say against it. That's where you're going to get the best stuff from all angles: science, theology, biblical studies, archaeology, the whole nine.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Steve. We've been happy to have you on. And
thank you,
don't
sir.
you all forget to like, share, and subscribe. And
Amen. I just want to say, David, I really appreciate it. This has been great and a wonderful opportunity. You doing this says a lot about you and your character, and I hope that this is what discussion on this issue looks like for a long time to come. So thank you for having me on.
Appreciate it.
Yes, sir. Thanks. Bye-bye.